Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Paes.
And today we are talking about the Enneagram around the world.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things, right? I love different cultures, I love traveling, and I love seeing the differences between students of each type in different places. And I know you like that a lot too, right?
Yes, I love traveling and I love visiting other countries and meeting the people and eating the food, of course.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to me that with the Enneagram, it's really something that is universal. And you really learn that when you meet people in different countries who also love the Enneagram and use it in their growth.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we are recording this because we are nostalgic. We are recording this during the pandemics and not traveling for over a year. We haven't been traveling. And so we want to remember.
Yes, I really miss traveling and being with our friends and colleagues in different countries. And so this is our way of revisiting our old life and hopefully future life. And also, I think we thought it might be interesting for people to learn about how the Enneagram is being used in different countries all around the globe.
Yeah, we can make a few comments about that also.
Yes, exactly. And I think for your social instinct, I know that you really, really love and respect different cultures. And one of the things I really appreciate about traveling with you is every time we go to a new country, you've taken the time to learn something about it. And you're very respectful and honoring of the local customs, and you try to get somewhat educated. In some countries, I think you know more about the culture than others, but you're always very interested in learning and kind of soaking in the culture of the country we're visiting.
Yeah, it's true. But I think it's not only my social instinct, but also my personal experience as a Brazilian who doesn't live in Brazil anymore and who has been traveling and not being a native English speaker and so on. So there is a certain sensitivity that I have with me, having gone through different sorts of experience, both very good and some that were challenging.
So I was thinking maybe we could start with maybe a little bit of the Enneagram history in terms of geography, and maybe start in Latin America,
Mm-hmm.
where you're from, and maybe tell us a little bit about your experience of the Enneagram in Brazil and some of the other countries in Latin America.
Mm.
After all, the Enneagram in the modern era, in the last 30, 40 years, really emerged from Latin America. Ichazo, who's one of the main people that brought us the modern Enneagram. We're not exactly sure what his sources were, but he started his work in Latin America, in Chile,
Yeah.
and I believe he was Bolivian. And then
Yes,
Claudio
he
Naranjo,
was.
who learned it from Ichazo and then brought it forward to the United States, and it kind of sort of dispersed from there.
Yeah, Naranjo
Claudio
was
Naranjo,
Chilean.
he
Yeah.
was Chilean and trained as an American, trained in America as a psychiatrist, but Spanish was his first language. And as you sometimes point out, a lot of the seminal Enneagram teachings in the last 40, 50 years derive from these really important figures who were from Latin America.
Yeah, so a few comments about that, and I appreciate starting with my region of the world, Latin America. Yeah, I think Latin America has this historic importance for the Enneagram, and also the first big meeting where Ichazo presented his uh, original concepts of the nine types happened in 1969, 1970 in Arica, which is the northernmost city of Chile. Now, the Enneagram had some development from that time in Latin America, completely apart from the later American development of it, North American. And at the same time, that wasn't much, and that was restricted because both Ichazo and Naranjo, as teachers, made sure that they would do that work in a more restrict way, like not very open, for concerns with the integrity of the system at that point. But later on, Latin Americans got also very interested in the approaches that the Americans had developed. And I mean, really 10, 20 years later, and started having books either in Spanish or in Portuguese. Latin America is mostly Spanish speaking, but Brazil is a big country in Latin America, an influential country, and we speak Portuguese in there. So when the books started to arrive, then many more people got in touch with the theories of the Enneagram, of the nine types. There was also a lot of Gurdjieff's work talking about the dynamic Enneagram, which is not really the typological Enneagram. So lots of other people studying that. But um, what I noticed, B, and I would love to hear your experience, is that the Enneagram is very appealing in countries like Brazil, because in Brazil we have a mix of religions that were undertaken by people, and with this interfaith mentality. Although it's mostly a Catholic country, but people really are really welcoming of other traditions, usually, although we do have some fundamentalism, in growing up as everywhere else in the world. But what I sense is that people are not as averse to spirituality, and they like something new, like the Enneagram, and that favors doing Enneagram work. So in my case, I didn't have as much of a hard time to take the Enneagram to organizations in Brazil, as I think that people uh, had in countries like the UK, the one I live in right now. It's not the same concern in terms of people wanting to know the scientific studies. What they are interested is if it works. And you and I know how much the Enneagram works. And people like new stuff and informal ways of teaching, which I also think the Enneagram invites for, with panel methods, with lots of interactive teaching methods. So, in short, the Enneagram grew uh, quite a bit in Latin America over time. There are very vivid communities in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, also Ecuador, um, and then Mexico, of course, and other countries. So it's really nice to see the work that happens in there. And always, each of those countries with several different teachers, different approaches, and their local Enneagram associations also.
Yes, for myself, the only countries I have visited in Latin America are Brazil, of course. I've been there many times. I love Brazil, and Argentina. And I noticed that there are really lively communities in these countries. And it's interesting. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression of Argentina is, and to some degree Brazil as well, is that culturally there's a bit more acceptance of like psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, probably more than Europe even, where there are a lot of cultures in Europe where they're a little bit more of the attitude of like, well, if you go to therapy, there's something wrong with you. Whereas my impression, but correct me if I'm wrong, because it's just an impression, was that in Argentina and Brazil, there's a lot more openness to kind of being in your psychological process, understanding your psychological process just from a growth and development point of view.
Yeah, I think you're right. Also about Brazil, but Argentina is by far the country that welcomes therapy the most. And in my view, it's a fourish country, Argentina, and I think that that helps. But it's even weird when someone says, "I've never done therapy in Argentina." So it's the
Mm,
opposite of the world
right.
in general. And I think it's the country with most people doing therapy, I mean, per capita, And yeah, it's quite interesting. And I think that that invites a bit more for Enneagram work. But in general, I think that there is an attitude of openness by Latin Americans to new things and to different approaches and integrative approaches. Like psychology plus spirituality is something that speaks the Latin American language, you know. Um, and but in terms of local aspects, cultural aspects, and what we see in types, perhaps it's a good thing to say that in those countries, you won't see fives that are very, um, how could I say, like,
Reserved.
reserved, introverted, as introverted or reserved or as fives in other places, because they need to adapt to that culture. And if you get Brazil, you see that everybody of all types look a bit more sevenish.
Right.
And I've seen teachers from other places seeing Latin Americans and saying this person cannot be a one because look how this person dances. Well, that's not one or another type. That's being Latin American, and
Yes.
having the flexibility and so on. So it's quite important to take into account culture, isn't it?
Yes, yes. There's a bit of a seven-ish overlay over many of the Brazilians that I've met. There's that comes from the culture, and I think this is an important and interesting thing to know about the Enneagram types. Is that although we find that they're really universal, that no matter what country you go to, a one is a one, a two is a two, a three is a three, a five is a five. At the same time, there are cultural aspects. We often call it a cultural overlay, where sometimes the type gets expressed a little bit differently depending on what culture you're in, because there are certain messages and local customs about what's okay and what's not okay, what's a good way to be, what's not so good, and that influences the way the type appears. But when you really talk to the person and when you really find out what's going on inside, the types show up much the same around the world.
And what is your experience be as an American, a type 2, a self-pressed 2, having taught in Brazil? What was your and you teach everywhere, so what did you see that felt different?
A few things. I think one is there is an aliveness, and I would say an upbeat mood with almost everyone you meet, sort of a friendliness, an openness, and a kind of a readiness to have a good time and feel good. And it is a little bit of a sevenish thing. But I have another thing I want to say that I thought was so funny in Brazil. We were doing a workshop, and the people were supposed to get into small groups, and this was back when we were still doing live workshops, so we were all in one room together, and we told them to get in groups. I think it was like in groups of 4, to discuss a particular thing. And every time we did this, they would be in groups of 6 and 7 and 8. was almost as if they couldn't form small groups. It was almost like the party started to happen and they just naturally gravitated toward doing these larger groups. Now, they worked, they were all very engaged and people were really talking. In some countries, you might do a larger group and maybe only three or four of the people would be talking. But in Brazil, it was more, it's like a festive atmosphere no matter what you're doing, I would say.
Yeah, what really happens is that usually we start following the rules, but then there is a bigger temptation of breaking the rules. And also, when you go to a restaurant, uh, uh, it might happen that in the middle of the meal you just join tables with the table by your side, that with people that you have never seen. So yeah, that happens. I remember that as a Brazilian, I found really strange when I got to the UK and someone told me, um, when you go to a pub or restaurant and there isn't any table available, it's totally okay if you ask those two people who are using a table for four to use those other two chairs of the same table. It's understandable, provided that you don't talk to them during the meal. And as
Right.
a Brazilian, I thought that was really different, a bit weird actually, although the five in me sort of liked that.
Yeah. Another thing that I thought was interesting along these same lines that you pointed out to me as a cultural difference is one time you and I were having dinner here in San Francisco, where I live, when you were here on a work trip. And we were having dinner at this really nice restaurant. And a few tables down, there was a famous person. The coach of the Golden State Warriors, was having dinner with his family. And I recognized him, and I even asked the waiter, "Is that him?" And it was kind of thrilling to see, especially him, because he's a really admirable character. He's a really great coach and a good person from everything that you hear in the media. And I remember what you said to me is, it's so interesting. It was interesting to you that nobody was going up to him and talking to him. That you said if it was in Brazil, like people would be constantly going and saying hello, and he wouldn't be left alone.
Yeah, for sure. That would never happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. And one last thing about Brazil is that people who do Enneagram work, I think that it's a bit easier for them to self-disclose, because there isn't much the concept of privacy actually, in a
Mhm.
society that you talk about everything. It's not very self-pressy, isn't? Yeah, do you
Yeah.
agree?
Yes, yes. I think people are so friendly and outgoing, and there is almost like an open-heartedness. So when we work there, it's really easy for people to well, look, they make it look easy, like they're ready to share and ready to talk about themselves in a very open way.
Yeah, and sometimes I'm thinking that we are just doing something spontaneous, and then I see that clients from other countries might be taking that as messy.
Yes, and that's a tension in our relationship because I always like structure and to be organized and to have everything look really good, and you would rather be spontaneous and innovative and go with the flow, which I appreciate. So I think hopefully it makes for a good partnership and
Yeah, I
both
love
a
it.
tension between the two and
Yeah,
a good outcome ultimately.
and it really helped me.
But let's talk about some other places. We might talk about the US next, although I don't really want to spend too much time on the US because I'm more interested in talking about all different countries than my own right now. But it might be good to say just historically that Claudio Naranjo, although he was from Chile, lived all of his adult life here in California in the Bay Area, and he taught at Esalen in the 70s. He taught with Fritz Perls. He was a leader in the Gestalt movement, which and the human potential movement. And he went down to Arica, Chile, and studied with Echazo, and that's where he learned the Enneagram from Ichazo and brought it back and really articulated it, refined it, developed it in working with a group that he had here in the Bay Area for many years that was all about doing different kinds of self-development work, meditation, gestalt, psychodrama, psychotherapy, psychotherapeutic techniques, and the Enneagram. And so because of that, I think because um, Naranjo started here and it sort of, the Enneagram kind of leaked out from his group, even though, as you said, he originally had asked people not to share it because of the integrity of the teaching, as you said. And Echazo and Naranjo, I think, had both big and legitimate concerns about the Enneagram sort of getting out there uh, in the mass marketplace. But nonetheless, it leaked out, and some books were written after that, and it really spread and became popular. But I will say that while I think the Enneagram really spread and developed and kind of got out there in the mainstream in the U.S., it's only actually been in recent years when it's really reached a much higher level of popularity. And so I think because of that history, I think that kind of explains why the US has been a focal point or one of the primary locations where the Enneagram theory and application and has developed, especially as it got into the mainstream. But I will tell you this. At an IEA conference, International Enneagram Association conference in 2004, and this is when you and I were on the board of directors. It was our first year on the board of directors. I was conference chair, and Claudio Naranjo's group came, and he didn't actually teach that much in the United States after the 70s and maybe a little bit in the 80s, but especially after the 70s. He actually taught more himself with his colleagues in Latin America and Central America and in Europe. And so his teachings were more located there, and sort of American teachers and authors really developed the Enneagram more here. And so in some ways, the Enneagram diverted a little bit from Claudio Naranjo's original work. And of course, you know, I'm a big fan of Claudio Naranjo's original work. And one of the reasons I wrote the complete Enneagram is to really highlight the importance of his work and almost to bring people back to a kind of um, rootedness in what I think is really a high integrity of his work, especially from the point of view of psychology. But all this is to say that I think in some ways the Enneagram that ends up spreading out to Europe and Africa and Asia, um, it to some degree, to some large degree, was influenced by what developed in the United States, especially in the late 80s and 90s. I think we hadn't really planned on giving too much history, but I think when we're talking about the geographic expansion of the Enneagram and maybe how it got around the world, I think that might be interesting for people to know who don't know that already.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting, and I guess that we are in the mode of telling a few stories. So, I'm not sure if I've ever told you, but in that conference in 2004, I coordinated a meeting only with people from outside the U.S. and with the presence of Naranjo, Don Rizzo, and more important teachers. And in that meeting, Naranjo said several interesting things that I had never heard. And one of them was he said that Ichazo told him that all that knowledge would be taken by the Americans and they would make it popular. And that's sort of what Americans are much better to do than Latin Americans, right? And then it also even said eventually it will come back to the whole world, but it needs a development by the Americans. And so I thought
Well,
that was very interesting.
that is interesting, and I'm so glad you said that because you reminded me to say what I was thinking of saying, which is at that conference, I had lunch with some of Naranjo's colleagues one day, and one of them said that they actually didn't like all the ways that the Enneagram was getting out into the mainstream in the United States, and what they called it was like the Mcdonaldization of the Enneagram. And so I think on the one hand, of course, so many people around the world are benefiting from the Enneagram teaching. So in the end, it's a very good thing that so many people have access to this profound material. On the other hand, there have always been concerns about what people would do with it because it is a powerful tool and it can be used as a weapon or it can be misused. It can be used superficially, and so I think of course we need to say that with anything has so much power and depth, there are wrong ways of using it, and you and I try to speak to those at the right moments when we feel it might be helpful to people. But I loved that she called it the McDonaldization of the Enneagram, and so I think it gives us a little bit of a sense of there was sort of a good side and a downside to the way the Enneagram spread in the United States. um, and then I think from to some degree to other countries from the United States. Although I also want to say that I think many countries have continued and did all the way along to have the influence of the Enneagram directly from Claudio Naranjo. For instance, I know he taught a lot in Brazil and in Mexico, in
And then
France and Germany and
Southern Europe, like
Italy and
Spain.
Spain.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, right.
Yeah, it's true. And one of the more specific concerns that both Naranjo and Rechazo had was they didn't want to see the Enneagram being used without a deeper psychological approach and hopefully also with a deeper spiritual approach. And that ended up happening, in the hands of different teachers. But I think that more and more people get aware of the importance of integrating properly, these two dimensions of the work and understanding it's not only a typology system to have fun with.
Yes, and I think another thing, and it makes me think of the Levels podcasts that have played probably right before this, is I think if we continue to try to evolve the Enneagram and put out higher level teachings, those of us who are really dedicated to that, it's like the people who are ready for that or want that find it. It's a little bit that people find the right application for them. And so I think it's about continuing to develop high quality, higher level uh, work with the Enneagram that is deeply rooted in sound psychological work and in transcendent spiritual work.
Yeah, and Gurdjieff used to say this Enneagram system self-regulates and takes care of itself, and when it's a truer teaching using the Enneagram, the right people come to it.
Hi. If you're enjoying the depth of knowledge offered in this podcast, you might want to stay in touch with us. Beat and Uranio offer professional Enneagram training, personal development courses, self-guided online courses, and they even have a membership platform with over 100 hours of content. Head to cpenneagram.com/podcast to learn more.
So let's maybe start talking a little bit about Europe and where we find the Enneagram in Europe and maybe some of the experiences we've had. Of course, you live in a country that used to be in Europe until right recently.
Mm.
So maybe we could talk about the UK and Europe, and what's going on with the Enneagram there. What experiences have we have? What do we notice about the Enneagram in the European countries and in the United Kingdom?
So, I think there are a few factors. If you take all European countries, what I observe is that European countries whose people speak good English, even if it's not the mother language, have an easier time getting access to books and teachers, and then the Enneagram grows more. And so a few examples are the Scandinavian countries, and also like Finland, Denmark, and all the Scandinavian countries. where Enneagram work is really spread all around, but also Sweden and Denmark and Norway, also Belgium, Holland, those countries that where people speak very good English. There is a good spread that happen over time on the Enneagram. Sometimes more in business, sometimes more in psychotherapy, sometimes for the general audience. And there are teachers that are super successful, and that, like, Denmark is a tiny little country with, I think, 5 or 6 million people,
6 million. Yeah.
yeah, inhabitants. And we have a very good friend of ours who has taught to over 30,000 people, I think, perhaps even 50,000 people, in Denmark. So it's quite interesting. And then there is a rich history of the Enneagram being taught in France by different teachers, also in Germany. But what I see is that in France, Germany, perhaps these are countries with a richer history of psychoanalysis, and sometimes, psychoanalysts took hold of the Enneagram, and it didn't spread all around as much, so I think it makes it a bit more difficult to spread the word of the Enneagram.
Well,
uh,
I think my experience, and as you know, my brother lives in Germany. My experience of Germany is that there is quite a bit of Enneagram there. Now, one of the founders of the IEA, Andreas Ebert, was from Germany, but he wasn't very active in the community after the early years. But what I've found is while there is quite a bit of Enneagram in Germany, it's not very connected to the international community, or we might say the English speaking community. And I think that's because while many people in Germany speak English, uh, there is a sense, and I asked a couple people about this at one point, like, why do you not see so many Germans at the international conferences? And what they said was that sometimes Germans do have a desire to share about the Enneagram in their own language. And so they'll have conferences within Germany, or they will basically have different kinds of schools in Germany, also maybe that don't interact too much. And of course, Claudio Naranjo has partners that work in Germany, connected to the Hoffman Institute there, and he when he was alive, he offered regular workshops and retreats in Germany, and so I think there was, and I went to a few of those, and I found an incredible mix of international people there. A lot, mostly from Europe, of course, from many different countries in Europe, but also some Russians and some people from South America, South Africa, rather. So I think that, but Germany has seemed to be a little bit more of a sort of a country unto itself when it comes to the Enneagram. Whereas, like you said, with Denmark and Finland, they've had a long-standing Enneagram community, very strong Enneagram community. There have been international conferences held there, and to some degree, Sweden and Norway have come along in the last few years. In fact, there was supposed to be a European Enneagram conference in Sweden last September that had to be canceled because of the pandemic. But yes, I think there's a lot there. But I also think there's quite a bit of Enneagram in the Netherlands and in Belgium, as you said, and in Spain and Portugal to some degree, and Italy, and France, as you said. But I think we see fewer French and Germans at the international conference, mainly I think because of language.
Right. Yeah, I worked quite a bit in different European countries, but perhaps even more in Spain, Italy, and Portugal. And my experience is that there is a lot of Enneagram work happening in Spain. In Italy, it's growing, but I think there was a little bit of a bigger initial um, sensation that what is that, is it really okay, maybe because of a bigger influence of Catholic religion and some doubts about it, but now it's really changing. And Portugal, perhaps in more recent years, with many teachers, is growing a lot. And what I see though is that it's that in Southern Europe is a little bit of that mix of being more free, spontaneous, like Latin Americans, but not doing as much self disclosure, and perhaps not much of the therapy background. And when it comes to the UK, you asked about the UK. I think it's a bit like what you said about Germany, and perhaps the more rational approach makes the Enneagram grow a bit more in business. And also, I think that the UK is still a country where uh, I don't have data statistics, but it feels like less people proportionally go do therapy, and when they go do therapy, it's more some kinds of therapy that don't necessarily go really deep in understanding the psyche and are a little more practical. Although there are many teachers in the UK, and I think it's similar to Germany in that they don't share as much all that is happening there with the international community. Now, Europe has so many countries, so different from each other, and also so much interested in keeping their own cultures and language and so on. So it's funny to see how different people in different European countries react to the Enneagram, and how the types are a bit different. So you and I usually say that France is a bit more four-ish, the UK is perhaps a little more five-ish, and Finland also five-ish, or other countries like Germany a bit more six-ish, and so on. Italy a bit more two-ish. So we see that playing out. So if you go to Italy, you will think that many people might be hard types, and especially Jews, but that's because of local culture. And perhaps even when you go to any Latin country, and also African countries in general, you'll think that people are sexual dominants, but they might not be. It's a bit of the effect of the general culture.
Yeah, I think France is definitely a 4 country, and there's a saying that Americans don't protest enough and the French protest too much. And I think you've said the UK is a 5. I still wonder if it's a 1 culture, but we don't have to talk about that now. But I think 5 or 1. But I do think there has been a lot of good Enneagram work in the UK, or in England and Ireland, especially.
Yeah, Ireland.
However, I've gotten the sense that there's not like a unified Enneagram community. We recently did a workshop and we had some people, an online workshop, and we had some people from England participating, and they were remarking that there wasn't too much going on there. I think that's changing. I think we have some colleagues and friends that are sort of scaling up what they do and getting more connected. Um, but I don't think always been integrated in the larger community, or that there's been a lot of it there. I do find that in the UK, and I find this in Australia, and I think also to an extent like in Germany and Switzerland and places like that, there is a kind of reserve and a little bit of a hesitance to open up to the Enneagram. For instance, you find more people asking about, is this scientifically validated? And if it's not scientifically validated, then I'm not sure we want to do it. So even in business, I find there's some hesitance. I worked with a company with the Enneagram for a while that had a lot of the company was in Switzerland, and there were often, those teams there were often very European, and some of the people could be very open and really understood the power of the Enneagram very readily, but other people were a little bit suspicious. And again, I don't think like depth psychotherapy is widely accepted as a cultural norm there. Certainly, I think some people do it, but I think it's a little bit more self-preservation oriented, maybe head oriented. I think Germany is a social six country. And I've heard that some of the Scandinavian countries are five-ish. So I think there is a way that while the Enneagram is, you do find it quite a bit in Europe, that it hasn't really been embraced so completely, especially maybe as a spiritual tool. It's been used a little bit more practically, and not always in the way that it is, I think, right now in the United States, where it's kind of experiencing a boom and a lot of young people are getting into it. And it is a lot of people who are, sort of more sort of see faith, their spiritual or religious faith is more central in their life, getting drawn to it and things like that.
Right. You mentioned Ireland. It's one of the countries I taught several times. And what I noticed, the Irish say that Ireland is the heart of Europe. They like to say that. And I sort of agree. And what I see is that they are very welcoming of Enneagram work in this more emotional way, and also a bit freer to, you know, I don't think they question it beforehand as much. And then also there are some other countries like Czech Republic that has a good community, and many other countries where the Enneagram is growing big way. And one of them is Russia. There is quite a bit of Enneagram work starting to happen there. And it's, I think that in countries like China, Russia, Egypt, South Africa, the Enneagram is thriving.
I just want to say that I do think that Ireland has a lot of great Enneagram work and a really nice community. In fact, you know that I have done the Enneagram and my Dante's Divine Comedy workshop in Italy. I did it for 4 or 5 years. We had to skip last year and this year because of the pandemic, but we're hoping to do it again next year in Florence, in Italy, where I sort of trace the Enneagram through the Divine Comedy as a map of transformation, as two maps of transformation. And interestingly, the impetus for doing that workshop in the first place was from some friends and colleagues in Ireland. And they really established this course. And I presented, they invited me to Ireland one time with a small group of people who use the Enneagram in business there. And I presented this to them, and they just thought it was great. And they were the ones that really started that program in Italy. And it was a little embarrassing, I have to say, to be an American teaching Dante and the Enneagram in Florence, because we didn't have too many Italians come. It was mostly Europeans and Americans. And I sort of felt like I didn't really have the right. But I do think that there is the Irish culture, like you're saying, there's a kind of heartfulness and openness that I think has really embraced it, and you find some amazing people using it in really deep ways there. So let's do go on. And since you brought up Russia, my experience. So we were invited to Russia a couple of years ago, but we didn't end up going for some reason. It had to be rescheduled, so we haven't been there. But when I did some of Claudio Naranjo's SOT work retreats in Germany, there were some Russian people there who had gotten into the Enneagram because Claudio had actually done a SOT retreat or two in Russia, and so I think that had helped spread the work there. I will tell you that something very new that's happening is I was contacted by a woman in Russia that wants to translate the complete Enneagram. So I think that's another thing. It's like where some of these translations are going. Often has an impact, like what of the sort of more major books in the Enneagram world have been translated into different languages. And so I'm very excited that there will be a Russian translation of the complete
Fantastic.
Enneagram available very soon.
Mhm.
And so I don't think it's hugely widespread in Russia, but there's definitely a foothold. And I've developed some friendships with people that I met at SOT who were based in Moscow and St. Petersburg.
And we had Russian students in our workshops in the UK also. What I think is that it's fast growing, in countries like Russia.
Yes. And one of the reasons why we're hoping to do more workshops in London when we can do that again in person is because I think London provides a nice hub for people from Europe, and we've had a lovely mix of people from different countries, and certainly it's easier for Russians to go there than it is for them to go to the US or maybe some other places.
Yeah, last time we had a workshop with 30 plus people, and we had 16 different nationalities present.
So before we talk about Asia, which I think is really interesting in terms of what's going on with the Enneagram in Asia, maybe let's talk. Well, maybe let's go down to Africa and talk about. I think the countries that we've been most connected to in Africa, South Africa and Egypt in the Middle East. First, what would you say about the Enneagram in South Africa? There's quite a bit of Enneagram there. I would say it's even maybe a global hub of Enneagram work.
Yeah.
What do you want to say about your experience in South Africa with the
Also,
Enneagram?
innovative work. People bring in a lot of beautiful approaches. I think that it's beautiful to see. I love South Africa and that land and South Africans. What I think that is the challenge is to integrate the different ethnicities and the different cultures within South Africa to come together to all this work. There is a lot of Enneagram work going on with the Africans community um, and the English community, but more and more it's reaching out, thank God, to all other communities, including Native Africans. And I absolutely think that countries like South Africa have a role to play in taking the message of the Enneagram of inclusion, diversity, and teach us all around the world about it. Yeah, and we have friends doing very good work in those places, so it's super um, lively. And then Egypt, wow, we decided to have Cairo as one of our main centers because of the enthusiasm of Egyptians and a great school that we found out there called the Field of Awakening. And it's really so nice to see how enthusiastic Egyptians are. And I think that that is spreading to several other Middle Eastern countries, because I think that Egypt sees itself more as a Middle Eastern country than an African country. And it's beautiful, beautiful. And I think that the natural religiosity of Egyptians and Muslims in general make it easier for the Enneagram of the spiritual dimension of the Enneagram to be something they talk about. So it's wonderful to see how the Enneagram is thriving in countries like that. It's really fast growing. Not to mention that there seems to be some connection between the ancient Enneagram and Egyptian culture. Yeah, so yeah, it's wonderful. And then you and I believe we think that Egypt is uh, what we could call self-preservation repressed, right? I see you
Yes.
being very scared when you see the traffic in Egypt. And it's funny that we have a friend from there who's a one, and she would not drive as an American would expect a one to drive.
Yes,
We
yes,
don't.
she was going with the flow of the crazy traffic there. Yeah, driving in a car is a little bit of a scary experience. I think it's easier if you're self-preservation repressed as opposed to self-preservation dominant like me.
Mm,
I will say that, what you were saying about South Africa and, you know, the hopefully the growing integration and diversity and inclusion of all kinds of people in the Enneagram work, I think it reminds me that it might be important just to name the fact that in many countries, and certainly here in the US, unfortunately, the Enneagram work has at times, most of the time, been something done with by people with privilege. And I've sometimes we've had this question of like, well, is the Enneagram inner growth work really only for people who can really afford to do that, either socioeconomically or, they're not having to worry so much about just survival. Um, and I do think that, you know, the way things have gone, and certainly things like being able to afford psychotherapy, being able to afford to go to workshops and retreats, has been a barrier to entry, unfortunately, for some people. I don't think that you need to be privileged to do good inner growth work, but of course, access to courses and materials and things like that is an issue. But I think that there's growing awareness about that issue, and that there are many teachers and organizations that work with the Enneagram around the world that are realizing that and actively working against making the Enneagram something that's only available to certain people. And so I just kind of wanted to name that. And I do think that's happening at different places around the world in different ways. And so that might be important to name. For instance, when we talk about China, the fact that, China, the people in China they do so much through their smartphones, that there are, very inexpensive courses that are taught to a lot of people just on the phone. A short course that you take on your phone can be, watched by, a million people in China, and it can be, quite inexpensive. So I think there's a trend happening in that way around the world. Certainly in the US, more young people are getting involved, and sometimes young people before they've established their careers can't afford to go to a big, a longer, more expensive workshop. So I think it's important to name that that is a trend that we're seeing everywhere, and that people are reaching out to different communities and trying to make uh, access to the Enneagram more affordable and more available to more people.
yeah, I really appreciate you bringing this up.
And just to say a few more things about South Africa, I think that when there have been people in different countries, and again, this is the way it's often gone historically, that have come to the United States to train with some of the early Enneagram schools that were established, again, starting in the late 80s, early 90s. Oftentimes those people have then brought those teachings or related teachings to their countries. And so there are some people, in South Africa with connections to the US who established their own teachings in schools there. And it's really spread out in many different ways. And I would say in South Africa, the Enneagram is really a lot in business. And partly that's because of innovations with a couple of companies there who have established tests, Enneagram tests, as a starting point into the Enneagram, and that those have been really have gotten into business in a big way in South Africa. I think to say a little more about Egypt, I think, yes, there's been an explosion of interest in the last, maybe 5, 6 years there. And we have the great good fortune to be connected with some amazing people, teachers who are teaching in a personal growth school. They don't just do the Enneagram, but in a very interesting way. It's a school that is really dedicated to raising awareness, and so they teach things like NLP and family constellation work and coaching, and the Enneagram fits in quite nicely with that. But I would say that those schools, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, what's been happening in Egypt, but my impression is that there are more schools like that, developing. growing up, being established, but they're still relatively new. And it's the Enneagram is a newer thing in Egypt, but certainly it's caught fire there. And there was a conference there in 2019, and there's a lot happening, especially around Cairo. So maybe let's talk about Asia at this point. Let's talk about. So I'll say a little bit about the experiences I've had there, and then I'd like to hear more what your experiences have been. So my first introduction to working with the Enneagram in a country in Asia was I was invited to Korea twice, and they Korea was one of the first countries to work on translating my books. So now both the Complete Enneagram and the Nine Types of Leadership are available in Korean. And I just found a really large, thriving, uh, dedicated community of Enneagram enthusiasts there. I went there to teach the subtypes both times because people from Korea who had traveled to other places had, learned about the approach I was using to the subtypes and invited me there. And I found that people are amazingly friendly and open and warm. And I've just had great experiences in Korea with their community there in the Enneagram.
Yeah, and then I had experiences in China and mainland China, which was fantastic. And I really liked all the students I found there. I think my experience shows me that probably China is the most vibrant country when it comes to embracing the Enneagram. It's something that people see as a mainstream thing, and because of the opening that happened in last years for things like the Enneagram, they are hungry for all of that. And of course, in China, the numbers are totally different. So the number of people who get interested is not to be compared with anywhere else. And then I felt really welcome with my style of teaching there. And then later on, you came along, for which I was very, very happy, and now you are teacher B. B is the name, that is sort of common in Chinese, in Mandarin. And I chose a name for myself. They have their American names, each Chinese person, and I chose a Chinese name for me. So they call me Teacher Young, right? And
Yeah.
we have so much fun teaching there, and people are so open and really ready to do good work. um, and there are some cultural aspects that are different, like the kind of respect that people have for a teacher is enormous. And that changes a few things. You need even to be careful, so that the student stays a bit critical with things that you say, because anything that a teacher says is taken as the truth. And but I really, really love our Chinese students. And we partner with a school in Shanghai that is brilliant. They do such a good work. They have a big presence on the internet, and they work seriously with the Enneagram. It's a pity that we haven't traveled there again during the pandemics, but works well, and our translator is great. So it's all good, and I really look forward to going back to China.
We've also been invited to Thailand, which was lovely. There's been actually quite a bit of, Enneagram in Thailand because there were a couple of teachers from the US that actually taught there for several years. One who had been a monk, and but we were invited by someone who we met at an international conference, and she actually first approached me to do a translation into Thai of the Complete Enneagram. And she invited us to come teach there. And we found a lovely, really group of people that she gathered to work with us. And It was interesting because I remember first we did a subtypes workshop there and we were doing panels, and we noticed that culturally, it was sort of not okay or not a good thing to be a three in the Thai culture because it's Thai people are very humble and very modest, and so it's not thought as a good thing. And you see this in some countries. You know, America, of course, is a three country, and so we find a lot of threes here, and three is a good thing to be here. But they're like standing out, wanting recognition, self promotion, those kinds of things aren't really too accepted in Thai culture. And so we found that there were no threes, and some of them were hiding out as other types. But then it was funny when we went to China, we were with a group of, I think the first group of students we were with were 40 people, and there were 14 threes. And I remember looking at the threes in the group thinking, okay, I know all those people aren't threes. And sure enough, I mean, again, the subtypes, we taught the subtypes that time, and that helps. Um, and we sort of we kind of made the picture a little bit clearer and more nuanced by bringing in the subtypes, and found that some of the types people that had typed as threes weren't threes, but it was actually a good thing to be a three in China. And I think the Chinese tell us that China is also a three country. And so it was just very interesting to see the differences in those two countries. But it's interesting too because there are certain ways of languaging things that I think you kind of learn that are sort of better and worse to communicate the Enneagram in different countries. But I think it's that's why we really appreciate working with local partners, and we're really honored and blessed to have some amazing
Yeah,
partners in these
indeed.
different countries that we teach in. And we rely on them to help us, orient to having a respect for the culture. Although then you come along and you mess up the hair of a self-pres one woman on a panel, and then we find out after you're not supposed to touch someone's head. So even though you're very respectful of cultural difference, I
Oh,
think that saved you, was that
mm.
the woman herself was very grateful and found it to be helpful,
Y-
as often your interventions are, even if they look surprising, let's say.
Right, right. Yeah, we
Okay.
have several interesting stories. Maybe another time we will have another podcast telling them, fun stories, sad stories, scary stories,
Touching
just
stories.
touching stories, and yeah, so there is
And
more to
maybe
talk about.
maybe just maybe we'll tell the story of how I wound up seeing the inside of a Chinese hospital.
Because of something that happened at a workshop.
Yes. Yeah,
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 maybe, maybe.
yeah, and let me tell you, I was impressed with the Chinese healthcare system because it
Yeah,
was quite efficient,
yeah.
and I got very great treatment,
Now
and
we can't
yeah.
forget to talk just a minute about Australia, New Zealand, right? In
Yes, I was
Oceania.
gonna say that, but before we go there, I just wanna say one thing about India.
Yes.
We haven't been to India, and I haven't heard of a lot of Enneagram going on there. However, I have been contacted by different individuals asking me different questions at different times, and I've sent my subtype book, my little subtype booklet there. And some of the people I've worked with in South Africa, I know have done some work in India. So I think there is Enneagram there. I don't know how much, but I know that is there, and it's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope we go there sometime. What is great also about Asia, like Thailand, India, is that those cultures are really open to spirituality, and we can teach the Enneagram as you and I like, with those higher level experiences and virtues and holy ideas, and that's very welcome.
Yes. So let's talk about Australia and New Zealand while we're in that part of the world. So Australia was one of the first places I was invited to teach. I think back in 2011, I want to say. And again, there was an Australian Enneagram teacher who had come to train at the same school that we trained in here in the US. And he had brought the Enneagram there. And subsequently, there have been a lot of Australians who have come and trained here and have really developed the Enneagram teachings and developed different communities. However, a little bit like the UK, I think it hasn't really taken hold at a deeper level. And the Australians tell me that they're probably a six culture, or maybe even counterphobic six, in that there's some suspicion of things that are spiritual or psychological at times. I've talked to some coaches that work with the Enneagram in Australia, and they say, it's a little bit rare to see the Enneagram being used in coaching or business in a widespread way. It's here and there, but I think there's a little more suspicion, mistrust, questioning. But we have many amazing colleagues in Australia and good friends. And I love, love, love Australia and the Australian people and the spirit of Australia. And so while it's there, I think it's sometimes, not as fully embraced as it is in some other places.
Yeah, what I see, B, is that it's a little bit of the same culture as the UK. And Australia was a colony of the UK. And, you know, I think that that comes from the very same positioning, wanting to have validation of different kinds, and that doesn't favor yet a system that works with both very deep psychological and spiritual concepts. Now, having said that, I also have the experience of having taught there several times in Australia. I also love the country and people there, and it goes really well when we just offer the work. And more recently, we've been getting more students from New Zealand quite interested, right?
Yes. In fact, in our 5-day workshop we just did last week, we had 2 people join us from Auckland, New Zealand, even though it was the middle of the night for them when the online course was scheduled. So I just felt so deeply grateful to them for going out of their way like that to join us. And I think there is a lot of growing interest in New Zealand. We also actually had some people travel all the way to the US. I think in 2019, 2018, before we couldn't meet in person, and that was lovely. And so I definitely think there's growing interest in New Zealand as well as Australia.
Yeah. Yeah, it's wonderful. I remember having worked once in Australia with a man coming from the Maori culture in New Zealand, and wow, my way of doing work. That was my work with the mat, the Enneagram mat, and we ended up doing the haka on the mat to help some healing with him.
And tell us what the haka is.
Well, the haka is that, the famous All Blacks rugby team in New Zealand, they do that movement, which is Aboriginal,
Mm,
before they start the match. It's like a
it's like a
demonstration of
dance.
force and dance. It's
Hmm.
really beautiful. And I think that my most remarkable occasion with the Enneagram B was when I had this amazing opportunity of doing some Enneagram work with the mat in an indigenous tribe in Brazil. And I got to work with people who are Indians, and then the chief Indian, who happened to be a woman, she said something that touched me so deeply. She said, "I'm liking this Enneagram thing because it's not something that you're coming here to teach me. It's like we know it in the inside and we just bring it out." So,
Oh,
yeah, it's so beautiful, isn't it, to see the Enneagram reaching out to so many different cultures, and such an honor that we have and privilege to be able to travel and share it with different people.
I think it's really something that has the power to unite us, and because it transcends culture and difference, and it's a symbol of unity and multiplicity.
Right. And if on one hand, you and I really miss traveling and seeing people in person, which is much better. This moment with the internet, because of the pandemics, allowed many people who can't travel, either for financial reasons or because of visas, to join our courses. So both ways have advantages, and it's so good to see the Enneagram spread all around.
So I think this has been great. I'm glad to be able to talk about the Enneagram all around the world.
Me too. Thank you for suggesting this theme.
It's time for our top five.
What is our top five today, B?
Our top five today is one I think people may find very interesting. It's the top five types most likely to start a fight on Facebook or social media generally.
Huh. Wow. Okay. I think I know why you came up with this theme, and you probably won't say. But yeah.
I've just
Right.
been
So, yeah.
I've just been noticing lately a few fights that have started on Facebook, especially, and just reflecting on the fact that, I think I go out of my way not to start fights, but fights do occur. And I was just reflecting on why this happens or what's going on. And, of course, fights happen in the world, but I think on Facebook or social media, it's sort of interesting because you're having the fight, but you're not actually in the room with each other. There's a way that something is happening where you can be at a distance. And also, I thought, especially I think in the Enneagram world or in Enneagram discussion groups, I think for me, one of the things I notice about the ways that sometimes fights get started is, differing views on things. But also, one of the things that I know, well, I won't get ahead of myself. We can talk about this as we go on.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I just want to say, B, that I considered who actually start an argument, because I could have had some different criteria here. Like, if it was people who start a controversy, and not yet a fight, but a controversy that will lead to a fight, I would have included sevens on my top five, because I have several friends who are sevens who do exactly that. They don't start a fight, but they write what they know will start a fight, and they have a lot of fun with that.
so they say something provocative, although that's technically maybe not starting a fight, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sevens aren't on my list either. Okay. So what did you put for your number five most likely to start a fight on Facebook?
I put once, because, yeah, ones can be very opinionated and go against more easily than other types. But it's only number five for me because I don't see that happening as much in written for ones. I think they hold back more, and they also tend to be more polite, even formal at times on social media.
That's very interesting because my number five is also one.
Hmm.
And this is because, I don't think that ones are at the top of the list of starting fights on Facebook. And many times, like you said, fives are more trying to be polite or appropriate or state their opinion as their own opinion. However, I think ones do have strong opinions. And actually, one of the things I admire about ones is they're often very forthright in stating their opinion. But of course, people with strong opinions can sometimes, or more likely, get into conflicts with others. And I think Facebook is no exception. So, what's your number four?
My number four is sixes. I think they start fights somewhat often, especially if they are sexual sixes, but also, just going against and offering. a different view on things and questioning, and that is sometimes the trigger of some fights. And I think that happens in my own experience a bit more with sixes than with ones.
I think we're having a mind meld here because I also put 6 at my position number 4. So I agree with you. I think, again, sixes can sometimes go against the authority or push back on people who have strong opinions and can, I think maybe some subtypes more than other subtypes, maybe more the sexual six than the other two subtypes, but also the social six because they can tend to be very intellectual and have strong opinions that they don't sugarcoat. So yes. Anything else you would say about why you put 6 there?
It's just experience, knowing many people's types. I just observe that sometimes, the fights start with or involve sixes.
Yeah, yeah.
What is your number three?
My number 3 is type 8.
Oh, why?
And well, I think, I do think eights get stereotyped as having more conflict than they do. So I want to say that at the outset. That said, I think eights can be very strong in their opinions. They can say things in a very authoritative way. And sometimes I think that's what sparks conflicts on Facebook is someone will say something as if it's fact. And I think sometimes eights can be that way. They can see their view as the only view or as equal to the truth. And so I would say that that's again one way that especially on Facebook where people are, at a distance and just writing things to each other, I think eights can be very strong in what they say and um not always considering other points of view right away. So that's why I put 8 right there.
Oh, interesting. Hmm.
What's your number 3?
Yeah, amazingly, it's also eights.
Wow.
Yay.
And we
Yeah.
didn't we didn't compare notes, people.
Are you sure you didn't copy mine?
I'm quite sure since you're in London and I'm in San Francisco.
Okay. So eights, what I would add on top of what you said is that they, um, you know, I don't think their preference is to fight online. I think they prefer to fight in person.
Right.
It gets a bit more physical. But I just think that eights sometimes simply lack the patience of doing that. And it's not my experience that most of the fights have started with them, although a few, yeah.
Yeah. And I just want to clarify for the listener that when you say eights get more physical, that doesn't mean
Oh
that
yeah,
they're violent.
yeah.
I think it just, I know you and I know what you meant
uh,
is that it's
you know my bad
visceral.
English also. Yeah.
Yes, it's more visceral, it's more energetic. And so of course, when yeah, I think body types, the body is always in the present moment. And so I think there's a way that body types connect
Measure
completely
energy.
differently. Yeah, exactly, completely differently when they're live in person. It's funny, I always think of my I have one of my dearest friends is a 9. And she was my best friend from graduate school, and we haven't lived in the same place for a long time. First she lived in Chicago, and then she lives in Connecticut. And she was so funny because I love her so much, but we don't really communicate very often. And one time I was visiting her, and we got together in New York City. She came down when I was there, and she said to me, I didn't know I missed you until I saw you. And I thought that was such a great example of the body type. It's like a little bit more, out of sight, out of mind, or out of present moment, out of mind. Um,
Yeah.
although, uh, although that's not true all the time, of course.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see, at least in my experience, that body types in general seem to be having a harder time during the pandemics, even than heart types. In general, I just see that it's not comfortable for most of them.
Yeah, yeah. So what's your number two?
And what I mean is isolation, not being physically together with others. But my
Right.
number two is a draw between twos and fours.
Wow.
Yeah, because, I'm not completely sure why, but I just observe that these two more emotional types, um, in practice, produce more conflicts than eights, even than eights. And I think that they sometimes might want to produce connection by doing a little bit of that. But I would like to also hear your explanation in case you feel something similar to this.
Yeah, I don't have two on my list. I actually, at my number two position, I have five. But I will say something about
Wow.
2 and 4. I actually don't experience the 2s that I know as starting fights on Facebook. I definitely think 2s can get involved in fights on Facebook. I've definitely seen that, but I think, like, if I think of myself and the self-pres 2s I know, it's like we're a little bit too sensitized to being liked to really say things that are too provocative as a first expression of something. I think sometimes we can get upset by things other people say, and sometimes we can have a hard time not reacting. So I would say that's true. But in terms of like starting the fight, I would say twos, not so much. Now, even the social twos, I know some of them, many of them are less personal on Facebook. It's really interesting. I'm thinking of a few, like more than one, and of course, it's a small sample set, but I think of some of the social twos I know, and they're actually kind of quiet on Facebook. It's like they do a little bit more promoting of their work and their events or their families or their kids. They're not so much making themselves very vulnerable on Facebook, interestingly. This is just my sense of things. And so my sense is that twos don't start it. However, I will say,
Mm,
twos will get into the fray once it starts. So I'm not saying that we
mm.
don't participate. I would just say if it's like most likely to start the fight, I would not put twos on the list. Now,
Maybe I
yeah.
considered you and you considered only other choose.
I never
I'm
start fights
joking.
on
I'm
Facebook. I
joking,
go
dear.
out of
I'm
my
joking.
way to try to avoid that. But of course,
I'm just provoking you so
I
that you
know.
start a fight.
Yeah, yeah. Now, so I start a fight with you, but that's different. And we're not on Facebook.
Yeah.
But let me say a word
But
about.
I just want to say that I find it really interesting that my number two is two and it's not on your list, and your number two is five and it's not on my list.
That is very interesting. And it's interesting that our first three were the same, and then we have each other at the number two position and not at all on our own list. So, but let me say something about five. When I've thought about, so one of the things I thought about is sort of the different fights that I've seen happen on Facebook over time, um, especially not so much lately, but especially a little bit in the past. I thought a lot of them were, and actually even I would say some of the comments that I see that piss me off on Facebook are from fives. And I think one of the things that I think is a trigger for me, and I'll own this myself, is when people say things that they make statements of opinion, but they frame it as fact, and they talk about something they know as an authority when I don't actually think they have the authority to say what they're saying. And I think sometimes I see fives doing that on Facebook. And I wonder if, social media is a little bit of an easier place for some fives to be provocative because they're at a distance. They're not actually there. I just remember there was one guy in particular I actually unfriended because I kept being infuriated by the things that he was saying on Facebook. It just, I think it's easier for them to be provocative. And I've just noticed that they make very strong statements. And again, I think probably not so much the self-preservation five. It's probably more the social five and the sexual five. And of course, sexual fives and social fives can be very warm and friendly and not at all conflictual. But I just think over like I thought of who has started most of the big fights that I've noticed on Facebook, and I know that in my experience,
Yeah.
some of them were fives.
I think there might be a hope for fives that if there is a conflict on social media, it will be a conflict of opinions as opposed to a conflict that happens in person.
Yeah, and I think what I'm really thinking is that one of the things that again I want to own that triggers me and gets me mad is when people make statements that sound very arrogant on Facebook. And so that's what I was thinking of, especially for my top two, is when I've seen, or top two or three statements that people make that it's like this or this is like this. And I notice when I communicate on Facebook, even when I'm saying something that I do know a lot about, that I am an authority on, potentially the few things I am, um, even then I try to state it a little bit tentatively. Like it might not be that for way for everyone, that I could, it's just my opinion, things like that. Whereas I think what triggers me is when people say things that sound very arrogant. And let's face it, sometimes fives can be arrogant. Although of course that's a generalization.
Thank you for saying this. What is your number?
My number one is four. And probably, and then I have in parentheses, most likely sexual four. And again, I love the sexual four, so I don't want it to be like it's not a criticism, it's just something I've noticed. That the people who I have seen in start fights, and sometimes it's inadvertent. Sometimes it's saying something as if I'm the final authority. And I think that's what sometimes people react to. Like they have a different opinion or they see it differently or they know it's different. And that person doesn't leave any room for disagreement. And that's, I think, what sometimes drives a conflict when people do disagree and they already feel like, you know, that person is not acknowledging that there could be any other opinion. So that was my number one. What's your number one?
Well, that was the same reasoning for me when I had four in my draw on number two. But my number one is the social repressed instinct person of any of the nine types, meaning that the
Ah.
social instinct is last on the instinctual sequence, and especially if
Ah.
the sexual dominant is first. I think that that particular sequence, sexual first, social last, leads to conflicts in general, but also on social media, to being more frequent. And I think, I left this for my number one because I do think that instincts on this case have a very, very big weight, even more than types. And yeah, that's what occurred to me. I know I changed the format, and that's sort of surprising, but yeah, this was my take.
Yes. That was very tricky of you to do that. I was wondering when you put 2 and 4 at number 2, what could possibly be your number 1? But
Yeah.
that's I think a good point to make, that when people's social instinct is repressed, there is often a kind of, just a tendency not to be considering how things will sound to the crowd. So that makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
Any last thoughts about this one?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, and I liked thinking about this one and then comparing our notes, and they were mostly very similar.
Yes, at least 3/5 of the way, they were very similar.
Yeah, even
Okay.
more than that. I
Thank you
also
for
had
listening.
fours as one of my number two.
Yes, exactly, that's right. It may be almost 4/5 similar. You just have to learn to see 2s more realistically, and then we'll be almost the same.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah, one of these days you'll learn. Okay.
yeah, I will. I'm doing my best.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for listening. Join us again for our Enneagram 2.0 podcast, where we talk about all things Enneagram.